Your Honor, my wife is a hero in uniform, but she is an absolute failure as a mother. Those were the vicious words my husband echoed across a crowded courtroom. He wanted to take everything from me, my 14-year-old daughter, my home, and my military pension. He smiled, thinking I was completely broken. He thought I had absolutely no defense. But when the strict, unforgiving judge finally looked up from his case files and locked eyes with me, the heavy wooden gavel slipped from his trembling hands. The entire courtroom went dead silent as the judge stared at me like a ghost and whispered, "Captain Jenkins, I signed your casualty report in Kabul 5 years ago. I thought you were dead. Sometimes. The hardest and most brutal battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but behind the closed doors of our own homes, and the most powerful weapon you can ever wield against a narcissist is the undeniable truth. If you believe in standing up for what is right, please gently tap the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with a woman who needs to remember her own incredible strength today. Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand your ground and fight back against a toxic partner? Your Honor, my wife is a hero in uniform, but she is an absolute failure as a mother. Those words echoed across the cold, sterile walls of the Fulton County Family Court. I did not take a breath. I simply stared straight ahead. My husband, David, stood next to his high-priced attorney. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He wore a perfectly practiced expression of grief. It was the face of an exhausted, abandoned single father. He had rehearsed this performance. I could tell exactly when he paused for effect. She spent 20 years putting strangers before her own flesh and blood, David continued. His voice cracked slightly. A masterful touch. The army got the absolute best of her. Our daughter, Chloe, got whatever scraps were left. A low murmur rippled through the gallery behind me. Someone sighed in sympathy. But it was not sympathy for me. I did not turn around to look at them. Instead, I kept my hands folded tightly on the heavy oak table. My knuckles were completely white. I wore my class's military uniform. It was perfectly pressed. My ribbons sat flawlessly on my chest. But in this room, those ribbons felt like a heavy chain around my neck. Judge Arthur Sterling sat high on the bench. He was an older man, with silver hair and a stern, weathered face. He quietly flipped through the thick custody file. He had the endless patience of a man who spent decades listening to the bitter ends of broken marriages. Outside, heavy rain lashed against the tall courtroom windows. It was a Tuesday morning. This was supposed to be a standard hearing. It had quickly become the hardest battle of my life. I was not afraid of losing my house. I did not care about the savings accounts or the cars. I was terrified of losing my 14-year-old daughter. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 42 years old. For 2 decades, I served as a combat medic in the United States Army. I spent more of my adult life sleeping on cots in dust-choked tents than in my own bed. I pulled wounded soldiers from burning wreckage. I held the hands of the dying in Kabul. I did it because it was my duty. I did it so my family could have a secure future. To David, my service was just a convenient weapon. He used my deployments as proof that I was an absent mother. He was demanding full primary custody. He wanted the house. He wanted a massive portion of my military pension. David's attorney stepped forward. Your Honor, Mrs. Jenkins has an admirable military record. We do not dispute her bravery. But this courtroom is not about medals. It is about a child. It is about being present. And my client has been the only present parent for the last decade. David lowered his head. He looked utterly heartbroken. If I had not shared a home with him for 15 years, I might have felt sorry for him too. My attorney, Eleanor, leaned in close to me. Do not react. Sarah, she whispered. Let him talk. We have the data. I nodded slowly. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. Judge Sterling adjusted his thick reading glasses. He finally looked up from the sprawling file. He cleared his throat. The sound silenced the entire room. Mrs. Jenkins, Judge Sterling said. His voice was deep and commanding. Would you like to respond to these allegations? The courtroom fell dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning vent above us. I pushed my chair back. I stood up. My legs felt heavier than they ever did carrying 60 pounds of combat gear. I took a deep breath. I will not apologize for my military record, Your Honor, I said. My voice was calm. It was steady. It did not shake. David smirked. He thought I was giving up. He thought I had no defense. I ignored him. I looked directly up at the bench. I locked eyes with Judge Sterling. For a fraction of a second. Something about the sharp angle of his jaw caught my attention. The scar above his left eyebrow. The intense, piercing blue of his eyes. A memory slammed into my mind. Smoke, screaming. The metallic taste of blood in the dry desert air. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Colonel Sterling. The judge froze. The color instantly drained from his face. His pen slipped from his fingers. It hit the wooden desk with a sharp clatter. He stared down at me. His eyes widened in absolute shock. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. Then, Judge Sterling slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back. He stood up. His hands gripped the edge of the bench. He leaned forward, squinting, as if he was seeing a ghost. Captain Jenkins. His voice was barely a whisper. It shook with disbelief. Is that really you? I nodded once. Yes, sir. David looked back and forth between us. His smug smile vanished entirely. What is going on here? He hissed. Judge Sterling did not even look at David. He kept his eyes locked on me. He looked like a man waking up from a terrible nightmare. Captain, Judge Sterling said, his voice cracking loudly in the silent room. I signed your KIA paperwork in Kabul 5 years ago. I thought you were dead. Chaos erupted in the gallery. The court reporter stopped typing. David gripped the edge of his table. His face turned a sickly shade of pale. Wait, David stammered loudly. He looked at his attorney, panic flooding his eyes. What does he mean? You know the judge. Eleanor, my lawyer, sat back in her chair. She allowed a very small, very cold smile to touch her lips. She knew exactly what was happening. Judge Sterling raised his hand. The gallery fell silent instantly. He did not reach for his gavel. He did not need to. The sheer authority radiating from him commanded absolute respect. He took a deep, shaky breath. He looked at me with a mixture of profound gratitude and overwhelming guilt. August 2021, Judge Sterling said softly. It was not a question. It was a memory, outside the wire. An IED hit our convoy. My vehicle flipped. You dragged me out of the burning wreckage. Captain, you packed my wounds while taking enemy fire. And then the second blast hit. I woke up a month later in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. Sir, I replied. My voice remained steady, though my hands trembled slightly. My dog tags were lost in the blast. I was admitted as a Jane Doe. I had severe burns and a traumatic brain injury. By the time I could speak and identify myself, my unit had already been evacuated. The paperwork was a mess. Judge Sterling slowly shook his head. I attended a memorial service for you. I stood in front of an empty pair of boots and a rifle. I blamed myself for your death every single day. David's attorney jumped up. Your Honor, I must object to this. This is highly irregular and deeply prejudicial to my client's case. Judge Sterling finally pulled his eyes away from me. He looked down at David's attorney. The warmth vanished from his face. He looked like a battlefield commander again. Counselor, you may sit down. Sterling barked. I know the law, and I know my duty. Sterling looked back at me. He gave me a slow, respectful nod. Captain Jenkins, you saved my life. You gave me the chance to watch my grandchildren grow up. I owe you a debt I can never repay. David crossed his arms. He looked frantic. He realized his carefully crafted narrative was crumbling to dust. He had painted me as a monster. Now the judge was calling me a hero. However, Sterling continued, his tone shifting into pure professionalism. Because of our shared history, I can no longer preside over this case. It would be a clear conflict of interest. Mr. Jenkins would have grounds for an appeal based on judicial bias. And I will not allow this trial to be dragged out any longer than it has to be. Sterling struck his gavel once. It sounded like a gunshot. I am recusing myself from this custody hearing immediately. This case is hereby transferred to Judge Helen Carter. We are in recess until she takes the bench at 1 o'clock. Sterling stood up. He looked at me one last time. Good luck. Captain, give them hell. As the judge disappeared into his chambers, David spun around to face me. The mask was completely off. His face was twisted in anger. You think this changes anything, Sarah? You think a new judge is going to ignore the fact that Chloe doesn't even want to look at you? I did not answer him. I packed my folders into my briefcase. David's words stung. They always did. But he was hiding a massive, ugly truth. My marriage did not break because I was deployed. It broke because David invited someone else in while I was gone. I met David 15 years ago. He was charming. He was supportive. When Chloe was born, he held my hand and promised we were a team. But society has a funny way of poisoning a marriage. Society loves a military father. But a military mother, she is constantly questioned. David's mother, Margaret, was the worst of all. She lived just 3 blocks away. She hated my career from the beginning. Before I deployed to Kabul, I heard her whispering in our kitchen. A real mother doesn't choose a combat zone over her child's ballet recital. David. She is neglecting both of you. David stopped defending me. He started believing her. And when I was shipped overseas to a war zone, he moved his coworker, Jessica, right into our house. He told Chloe I was too busy playing soldier to care about them. He poisoned my daughter's mind. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, pulling me back to the present. The courtroom was mostly empty now. David had stormed out into the hallway. Are you ready for round 2? Eleanor asked quietly. Judge Carter is tough. I noted. She is. Eleanor agreed. She opened her laptop. The screen glowed brightly, but Judge Carter only cares about hard evidence. David thinks he won the narrative because Chloe is angry with you. But he does not know what we've found in his digital footprint. Eleanor smiled. It was a dangerous, predatory smile. He called you a failure. Sarah, now, we are going to show the court exactly who the real monster in this family is. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The bailiff instructed everyone to rise. Judge Helen Carter strode into the room, her black robe billowing slightly behind her. She did not have the warm, veteran camaraderie that Judge Sterling possessed. Judge Carter was known throughout the county as a strict, no-nonsense magistrate who had zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. She took her seat at the high bench, adjusted her microphone, and immediately ordered the proceedings to continue. David looked slightly relieved. He mistakenly believed that a judge without a military background would naturally side with him, the supposed abandoned father. He smoothed his expensive tie and confidently took the witness stand to begin his testimony. Under the gentle questioning of his own attorney, David painted a devastating portrait of my character. He spoke with a practiced, sorrowful tone, explaining how difficult it had been to raise our daughter alone while I was deployed. He claimed that I was obsessed with my military career, that I cared more about the uniform than I did about my own family. The most painful part of his testimony was when he brought up Chloe's feelings. Sarah completely abandoned us, David said, looking directly at Judge Carter with tear-filled eyes. Chloe waited by the phone for months. She sent emails. She begged for her mother to just say goodnight, but Sarah never responded. My daughter is heartbroken, Your Honor. She does not want to live with a woman who completely forgot she existed. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, I felt a physical pain in my chest. I looked over at the gallery where 14-year-old Chloe was sitting next to a court-appointed guardian. My daughter's face was pale, and she was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with me. My heart shattered into a million pieces. During my time in Kabul, I had spent every free second writing emails to her. I had sent her pictures, told her stories, and apologized for the terrible internet connection that supposedly prevented my messages from going through. I thought the military servers were failing. I thought I was just unlucky. But as I sat in the courtroom, I knew the dark truth. Your witness, counselor, David's attorney said, taking her seat with a triumphant smirk. Eleanor stood up. She did not bring a notepad to the podium. She brought a thick, black binder. The courtroom was dead silent as she approached the witness stand. Mr. Jenkins, Eleanor began, her voice perfectly even. You just testified under oath that my client, Captain Jenkins, never attempted to contact her daughter during her 15-month deployment to Afghanistan. Is that correct? That is correct, David answered firmly. She abandoned us. Eleanor opened the binder. Mr. Jenkins, are you familiar with a software application called Secure Family Guardian? David's confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny bead of sweat appeared at his hairline. I think it's a standard parental control app to keep kids safe from predators online. Exactly, Eleanor said, pulling a document from the binder and handing it to the bailiff to present to the judge. It is a very robust application. It allows a parent to monitor web traffic, restrict screen time, and, most importantly, completely block specific email addresses and IP addresses from ever reaching the child's devices. Your Honor, I present Exhibit D, the administrative logs from the Jenkins household router and Chloe Jenkins's personal devices. Judge Carter put on her reading glasses and scanned the document. Her brow furrowed deeply. Mr. Jenkins. Eleanor's voice grew louder, echoing off the wooden walls. These digital forensic logs were obtained via subpoena. They show that on the exact day my client deployed to Kabul, you logged into the administrative portal of this application. You manually entered Captain Jenkins' official military email address, her personal Gmail address, and her Skype username into the firewall's permanent block list. Every single email Sarah sent to her daughter was intercepted and deleted by your server before Chloe could ever see it. The courtroom erupted into a collective gasp. In the gallery, Chloe's head snapped up. She looked at her father in pure horror. That's a misunderstanding, David stammered, gripping the edges of the witness stand. The system must have flagged her military server as spam. I was just trying to protect my daughter from internet viruses. You were protecting your own narrative, David, Eleanor snapped, dropping the polite legal facade. Your Honor, this is a textbook, documented case of parental alienation syndrome. The respondent actively and maliciously isolated a child from her mother, weaponizing the mother's military service to inflict severe psychological abuse. He didn't just break a marriage. He systematically erased a mother from her child's life to secure a favorable divorce settlement. David looked trapped. He turned to attorney for help. But she was furiously flipping through her own notes, realizing her client had lied to her. Judge Carter stared down at David. Her expression hardened into absolute disgust. The illusion of the perfect, suffering father was dead. But Eleanor was not finished. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from tense to suffocating. David was visibly shaking on the witness stand. He kept glancing nervously at the gallery, where his mother, Margaret, sat clutching her designer handbag. Eleanor paced in front of the podium, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the judge to fully digest the horrific reality of the intercepted emails. But a custody battle is rarely just about emotional manipulation. It is almost always about money. And Eleanor was ready to follow the money trail. Let's move on to finances, Mr. Jenkins, Eleanor said, flipping to the next tab in her binder. In your initial affidavit, you claimed severe financial hardship. You stated that raising a teenager single-handedly while your wife was overseas drained your life savings. You used this claim to demand not only full possession of the marital home, but also 60% of Captain Jenkins' military pension. David swallowed hard. Groceries are expensive. Teenagers are expensive. I was doing my best to keep our heads above water. I see, Eleanor replied dryly. She pulled a thick stack of bank statements from her binder. Your Honor, I present Exhibit E, a comprehensive forensic audit of the Jenkins family accounts, including the college trust fund established for Chloe Jenkins. Judge Carter accepted the documents. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowed. Mr. Jenkins, can you explain to the court why? Precisely 3 months into my client's deployment, $45,000 was withdrawn from Chloe's college trust fund, Eleanor asked, her voice ringing with authority. David's face turned the color of ash. I had to make emergency repairs on the house. The roof was leaking. It was for Chloe's benefit. That is a fascinating explanation. Eleanor countered swiftly. Because the financial records indicate that this money was wired directly to a luxury real estate agency in Aspen, Colorado. It was used as a down payment on a ski resort timeshare. And the deed for this timeshare is co-signed by you and a woman named Jessica Miller, your alleged coworker who conveniently moved into the marital home while my client was dodging mortar fire in Afghanistan. In the gallery, Margaret let out a loud, indignant gasp. Chloe covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as she realized her father had stolen her future education to fund an affair. You committed financial fraud, Mr. Jenkins, Eleanor stated, staring him down. You stole from your own child, moved your mistress into my client's bed, and then had the audacity to stand in this courtroom and call Captain Jenkins a failure. David had no answer. He sat in the witness chair, entirely broken, staring blankly at the microphone. His attorney mercifully declined to redirect, and David stumbled back to his seat, but Eleanor's was not done. She immediately called Margaret Jenkins to the stand. David's mother smoothed her skirt and walked to the front of the room, projecting the image of a dignified, concerned grandmother, Mrs. Jenkins. Eleanor began. You have been very vocal about my client's fitness as a mother. You submitted a sworn character reference claiming you witnessed Captain Jenkins's neglect firsthand. I did, Margaret said, lifting her chin proudly. I am a traditional woman. I believe a mother's place is at home with her child, not wearing combat boots in the desert. My son stepped up when she abandoned her duties. I only wanted what was best for my granddaughter. I never interfered in their marriage. You never interfered, Eleanor repeated, raising an eyebrow. She walked over to the evidence table and picked up a small USB drive. Your Honor, during digital discovery, we obtained a backup of Mr. Jenkins' cellular device. It included several saved voicemails. Margaret's proud posture instantly collapsed. Eleanor plugged the drive into the court's audio system. This is a voicemail left by Margaret Jenkins on David Jenkins' phone. Dated 2 weeks before the divorce papers were filed. Eleanor pressed play. Margaret's sharp, distinctive voice echoed through the courtroom speakers, entirely devoid of her sweet grandmotherly tone. David, it's Mom. Listen to me. You need to file the paperwork before she gets back from Germany. I don't care if she's recovering from the blast. You keep using that app to block her emails. Just keep the girl away from her mother until the divorce is finalized. And you will get the house and the pension. Don't go soft on me now. Break her. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret sat frozen on the witness stand, her mouth opening and closing like a trapped fish. David buried his face in his hands. Judge Helen Carter took off her glasses. She looked at Margaret, then at David, with an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. Mrs. Jenkins, you may step down, the judge ordered, her voice dangerously quiet. If you say a single word, I will hold you in contempt of court. Margaret scrambled out of the witness box and practically ran out of the courtroom doors. I looked back at the gallery. Chloe was looking directly at me. For the first time in over a year, she did not look at me with anger or resentment. She looked at me with profound sorrow and understanding. The toxic illusion her father and grandmother had built was completely shattered. They had tried to erase me, but the truth had finally dragged them into the light. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom slowly clicked shut behind Margaret Jenkins, but the ringing silence she left behind was absolutely deafening. David remained slumped in the witness chair, staring blankly at the floor. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world crumble into dust. And in many ways, He had, his meticulously crafted narrative of the suffering. Abandoned father was completely obliterated, replaced by the undeniable reality of his own greed and manipulation. Judge Helen Carter sat high on the bench, her expression as hard and unyielding as carved granite. She looked down at David with a mixture of professional detachment and profound personal disgust. She did not need to ask for closing statements, the digital forensic logs, the financial audit, and the damning voicemail had done more than any closing argument ever could. Suddenly, David stood up. Panic flared in his eyes as he looked toward the gallery. He completely ignored the protocols of the courtroom. "Chloe, grab your coat," David ordered, his voice trembling but attempting to project authority. "We are leaving. We are going home right now." Chloe did not move. My 14-year-old daughter sat frozen in the heavy wooden pew, her small hands clutching the edge of the seat. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. But as she looked at the man she had trusted her entire life, a new emotion washed over her face. It was the devastating realization of betrayal. "Chloe," I said, "let's go," David snapped, taking a step toward the low wooden partition that separated the gallery from the legal floor. "Mr. Jenkins, you will remain exactly where you are." Judge Carter's voice cracked through the room like a physical whip. "You do not have the authority to dismiss anyone from this courtroom, least of all the minor child, whose psychological well-being you have so recklessly endangered." Chloe slowly stood up. She did not look at her father. Instead, she turned her head and looked directly at me. The icy barrier that David had spent over a year building between us, the lies, the blocked emails, the insidious whispers that I had chosen the military over her, was entirely shattered. She saw me not as an absent soldier, but as a mother who had desperately tried to reach her. Chloe stepped out of the pew, walked past her father without so much as a glance, and ran straight into my arms. I stood up and caught her as she collided with me. I wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders and pulled her tightly against my chest. I buried my face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of vanilla shampoo, and let the tears I had been holding back for months finally fall. Chloe buried her face in my uniform jacket, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, Mom," she choked out, her voice muffled against the fabric. "I thought you didn't care." "He told me you didn't care." "I'm here, baby," I whispered fiercely, holding her so tightly I was afraid I might never let go. "I never stopped writing. I never stopped loving you. I am right here." Judge Carter allowed the emotional moment to linger before gently clearing her throat. I slowly released Chloe, though I kept one arm firmly wrapped around her shoulders as we faced the bench. "This court has reviewed all presented evidence, and frankly, I am appalled," Judge Carter began, her eyes locking onto David. "Mr. Jenkins, the family court system is designed to protect the best interests of the child. It is not a weapon for you to wield in order to fund your extramarital affairs and secure real estate in Colorado. You intentionally and maliciously engaged in a severe campaign of parental alienation. You weaponized Captain Jenkins' honorable military service against her, manipulating a vulnerable teenager into believing she had been abandoned." David opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised a single, commanding finger, silencing him instantly. "You stole $45,000 from your own daughter's college trust fund to purchase a timeshare with your mistress," Judge Carter continued, her tone dripping with condemnation. "You digitally intercepted a mother's attempts to communicate with her child from an active war zone. Your actions are not merely unethical, they border on criminal fraud." The judge picked up her pen and looked down at the official decree, effective immediately. "I am granting Captain Sarah Jenkins full primary physical and legal custody of Chloe Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, your visitation rights are entirely suspended pending a comprehensive psychological evaluation and mandatory supervised family counseling. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate liquidation of the Aspen timeshare. You are ordered to repay the $45,000 to Chloe's trust fund, plus interest, within 60 days. If you fail to meet this deadline, I will personally refer this case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution regarding financial fraud. Judge Carter struck her gavel with finality. This court is adjourned. David collapsed back into his chair, utterly defeated. His attorney quickly packed her briefcase and walked away without offering him a single word of comfort. Eleanor turned to me, a brilliant, victorious smile on her face. We had not just won the battle. We had completely decimated the enemy. I looked down at Chloe, wiped a tear from her cheek, and smiled. We were finally going home. Healing does not happen overnight. It is not a magical erasure of pain, nor is it a sudden return to the way things used to be. True healing is a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding trust, brick by fragile brick. 6 months after the gavel fell in Judge Carter's courtroom, Chloe and I were still navigating the complex emotional wreckage David had left behind. We moved into a bright, quiet townhouse on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was a fresh start, entirely free from the toxic memories of the house David had contaminated with his lies. Twice a week, Chloe and I attended family therapy. The therapist helped Chloe process the immense guilt she felt for believing her father, and she helped me learn how to be fully present after 2 decades of hypervigilance in the military. It was hard, exhausting work, but for the first time in years, our home was filled with genuine laughter instead of suffocating tension. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I was officially finalizing my medical retirement from the United States Army. I was standing in the kitchen, carefully folding my uniform and placing my medals into a wooden shadow box, when the doorbell rang. Chloe ran downstairs to answer it. A moment later, she walked into the kitchen, looking slightly confused. "Mom, there's a man at the door. He says he knows you." I walked into the living room and froze. Standing in the doorway, dressed in a sharp civilian suit instead of his judicial robes, was Arthur Sterling. The former judge smiled warmly, his piercing blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "I hope I am not intruding, Captain Jenkins," Sterling said, removing his hat. "Not at all, sir. Please, come in," I replied, gesturing toward the living room. Sterling stepped inside and looked around the peaceful home. He turned to me and held out a small, heavy object. It was a solid bronze military challenge coin, bearing the insignia of his old unit in Kabul. He pressed it firmly into the palm of my hand. "I did not get the chance to say everything I wanted to say in that courtroom," Sterling said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "When I signed your casualty report 5 years ago, a piece of my soul died with it. I have spent years carrying the weight of your sacrifice. Coming here today, seeing you alive, seeing you with your daughter. It is the greatest closure an old soldier could ever ask for. Thank you, Sarah, for my life." I looked down at the heavy bronze coin, deeply moved. "It was my honor, sir, truly." Sterling gave me a crisp, respectful salute, which I proudly returned, before he quietly saw himself out. As the door closed behind him, I looked at Chloe. She was smiling, finally understanding the true depth of what my service had meant. It took me 20 years of military service to realize that the hardest, most brutal battles aren't always fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they are fought in our own homes, behind closed doors. We live in a society that is incredibly quick to judge a woman's choices. If a man leaves his family to serve his country, he is given a parade. He is called a patriot. But if a mother does the exact same thing, she is interrogated for her absence. She is labeled a failure. But true equality means recognizing that a mother's love isn't just measured by the physical hours she sits in a living room. It is measured by the immense sacrifices she makes to build a safer, better world for her child to grow up in. What David did to me wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage vows. It was a violation of basic human rights, manipulating a child's mind, intentionally blocking a mother's love, and weaponizing a child's affection to destroy another parent. That is not just a dirty divorce tactic. That is psychological violence. Parental alienation is a profound form of emotional abuse, and we need to stop pretending it is just a normal byproduct of a bad breakup. I didn't fight back in that courtroom for revenge. I did not want to destroy David just to watch him suffer. I fought back because my daughter deserved the absolute truth. Healing isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. It's about reclaiming your own narrative. It's about standing in the blinding light of truth and saying, I am here, I am worthy, and I will not be erased. If you are watching this video and you have ever been made to feel like an absolute failure by the very person who promised to protect you, remember this: their lies do not define your reality. Please take this as a serious warning. Parental alienation and financial abuse are silent, insidious epidemics. If you recognize these red flags in your own life, forced isolation, intercepted communications, sudden financial secrecy, or a partner who constantly gaslights your reality, please reach out to a legal professional or a domestic abuse hotline immediately. You do not have to fight this war alone. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with a woman who needs to be reminded of her own incredible strength. Drop a comment below and tell me, how did you find the courage to walk away from a toxic situation? Let's support and uplift each other in the comments section. Until next time, stay strong, trust your truth, and always protect your peace. The 60-day deadline imposed by Judge Carter hung over David Jenkins like a slowly descending guillotine. When the gavel had fallen in that Fulton County courtroom, David had still harbored a fragile, delusional hope that he could simply charm his way out of the consequences. He had spent his entire adult life manipulating situations to fit his preferred narrative, effortlessly shifting blame onto others. But the legal system, guided by the unforgiving scrutiny of Judge Helen Carter, was utterly immune to his practiced sorrow and manipulative tears. The court order was absolute: liquidate the Aspen timeshare. Repay the stolen $45,000 into Chloe's educational trust fund with interest, or face criminal prosecution. David quickly discovered that the reality of a forced liquidation was brutal. The luxury timeshare, which he had purchased at a premium to impress his mistress, was practically worthless on the rapid resale market. Desperation began to set in as the first 30 days evaporated. David's credit score was already severely damaged by the expensive legal fees and the lavish lifestyle he had maintained while attempting to project the image of a successful, independent father. Traditional banks laughed at his loan applications, with no other options. He turned to the woman who had helped him spend the stolen money. Jessica the Miller had been more than happy to play the role of the devoted future stepmother when it came with fully paid vacations, expensive dinners, and a rent-free existence in the house that Sarah's military deployments had paid for. But the moment David returned from court, completely stripped of his primary custody, ordered to pay massive restitution, and facing potential prison time, Jessica's warm affection evaporated into thin air. The confrontation occurred on a rainy Tuesday evening in the cramped, overpriced apartment David had been forced to rent after being legally evicted from the marital home. He had begged Jessica to take out a personal loan to help cover the trust fund deficit, reminding her that her name was also on the Aspen deed. Jessica had simply laughed, a cold, hollow sound that finally shattered David's romantic illusions. She methodically packed her designer suitcases, informing him that she was not going to sink with his ship. She had never loved him. She had loved the financial convenience and the stability he provided. Within an hour, she was gone, leaving David alone in the dark apartment with nothing but a mountain of legal debt and the terrifying reality of his impending deadline. With only 10 days remaining and his options entirely exhausted, David swallowed the last remnants of his pride and drove to his mother's pristine suburban home. Margaret Jenkins had always been his greatest enabler, the woman who had constantly fueled his resentment toward Sarah and actively encouraged the parental alienation that had led to his downfall. David assumed she would write him a check, if only to protect her beloved son. But he had fundamentally underestimated Margaret's obsession with social standing. The devastating details of the custody battle and the financial fraud had inevitably leaked into her exclusive social circles. Her wealthy friends at the local country club had suddenly stopped calling. The severe shame of being associated with a very public, humiliating scandal had infuriated her beyond reason. When David desperately pleaded for the money, standing in the grand foyer of the house he had grown up in, Margaret stared at him with an expression of absolute disgust. She did not offer him a warm embrace or a sympathetic ear. Instead, she coldly informed him that he had completely humiliated the family name. She blamed him entirely for getting caught, criticizing his clumsiness rather than his profound immorality. "I told you to be smart about the divorce, David," Margaret had hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Instead, you let that military wife make an absolute fool out of you in a public courtroom. And you expect me to bankrupt my retirement to fix your sloppy mistakes? Absolutely not." She closed the heavy front door right in his face, locking him out of her life just as thoroughly and heartlessly as he had tried to lock Sarah out of Chloe's. Day 60 arrived without a miracle. David stood before Judge Helen Carter once again, his expensive custom suit looking slightly rumpled, his arrogant posture entirely defeated. His attorney informed the court that the funds could not be secured. Judge Carter did not blink. She did not offer an extension. True to her word, she signed the legal order referring the case to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal prosecution regarding the embezzlement of a minor's trust. Two uniformed bailiffs approached David from behind, instructing him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent courtroom was the final, devastating punctuation mark on the illusion he had built. David Jenkins, the man who had tried to steal his daughter's mind and her future, was escorted out of the building in disgrace, finally forced to pay the ultimate price for his profound arrogance. 2 full years had passed since the heavy oak doors of the courtroom had closed on David's fabricated reality, and the transformation in our lives was nothing short of miraculous. The dark, suffocating clouds of anxiety that had once defined our daily existence had entirely dissipated, replaced by the bright, steady light of genuine healing. Chloe was now 16 years old, a vibrant and resilient high school junior who was thriving in ways I had only ever dreamed of while sleeping on military cots thousands of miles away. The hollow, defensive teenager who had once refused to look me in the eye was completely gone. In her place was a confident, empathetic young woman who had learned the hard way that true love is always built on unwavering honesty, not manipulative whispers. Our relationship had been slowly rebuilt, forged in the quiet, peaceful moments of ordinary civilian life. We established new traditions that belonged exclusively to us. Every Sunday morning, we cooked breakfast together in our sunlit kitchen, playing loud music and talking about everything from her college aspirations to the complexities of her history assignments. I had finally learned how to leave the hypervigilant combat soldier behind and simply be a mother. I stopped scanning perimeters and started focusing entirely on the beautiful reality unfolding right in front of me. The $45,000 stolen by David had eventually been recovered through the aggressive liquidation of his remaining assets during his criminal trial, securing Chloe's educational future once again. But more importantly, the emotional trust fund between us, which had been so viciously bankrupted, was overflowing. My transition out of the United States Army had provided me with a unique opportunity to channel my painful experiences into a powerful new mission. The profound sense of isolation I had felt when I realized my husband had intentionally blocked my communication with my daughter had left a permanent mark on my soul. I knew, with absolute certainty, that there were thousands of other deployed service members facing the exact same insidious psychological warfare. Motivated by this realization, I founded a nonprofit organization called the Defender's Shield. Our mission was simple but vital, providing pro bono legal advocacy and digital forensic resources to military parents who were victims of parental alienation syndrome. I spent my days lobbying for legislative changes, educating family court judges on the unique vulnerabilities of deployed parents, and helping other soldiers reclaim the families they had fought so incredibly hard to protect. On a crisp October afternoon, the culmination of my new life's work brought me to a grand auditorium in downtown Washington, D.C. I had been invited to deliver the keynote address at a national symposium on veterans' family rights. As I stood behind the polished wooden podium, looking out over a vast sea of military uniforms and civilian advocates, I felt a profound sense of inner peace. I was not wearing my classy uniform. I was wearing a sharp civilian suit, representing a brand new chapter of leadership. But the intense discipline, the resilience, and the unyielding commitment to justice that the Army had instilled in me were as present as ever. I looked down into the front row of the massive audience. Chloe was sitting there, beaming with pure pride, her phone raised high to record my speech. Sitting directly beside her, having flown in specifically for the event, was retired Judge Arthur Sterling. He gave me a subtle, encouraging nod, the exact same respectful acknowledgement he had given me in that courtroom 2 years prior. I took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and let my voice fill the massive room. I spoke passionately about the invisible wounds of war that happen strictly on the home front. I spoke about the devastating impact of weaponizing children in divorce proceedings, and the absolute necessity of holding manipulative parents legally and financially accountable for the emotional violence they inflict. We are taught, soldiers, to strictly protect our perimeters against foreign threats. I told the silent, captivated audience. But absolutely, no training prepares you for the enemy that sleeps in your own home, the enemy that uses your honor, your duty, and your sacrifice as evidence of abandonment. We must demand a legal system that recognizes parental alienation not as a simple marital dispute, but as the severe psychological abuse that it truly is. We must protect the sacred bond between a child and a parent who is serving this great nation. When I finished speaking, the entire auditorium erupted into a massive standing ovation. As the thunderous applause washed over me, I didn't look at the politicians, the lawyers, or the military brass. I looked only at Chloe. She was standing tall, clapping fiercely, tears of pride shining brightly in her eyes. We had walked through the darkest valley of deception and emerged so much stronger, forever bound by a truth that no one could ever intercept or delete. The terrible war was finally over, and for the first time in my entire life, I was exactly where I was always meant to be, safely at home. The reality of a state penitentiary is incredibly loud. There is no quiet time. There is only the constant, echoing slam of heavy metal doors. There is the endless shouting of guards. There is the suffocating reality of complete confinement. David Jenkins sat on the edge of a thin, rigid mattress. He stared at the cinder block wall of his small cell. He had been incarcerated for 18 months. The luxurious custom suits were entirely gone. The arrogant smirk had vanished completely. He wore a faded orange jumpsuit. He looked 10 years older than his actual age. His hair was thinning and entirely gray. David had always survived by using his charm. He had survived by manipulating the people around him. But in this cold, brutal environment, charm was absolutely useless. No one cared about his fabricated stories. No one cared about his complaints. He was just another inmate serving time for financial fraud. The isolation he felt was absolute. It was a crushing, daily reminder of his own actions. He had spent months intentionally isolating his daughter from her mother. Now the universe had returned the favor. He was completely alone. His mother, Margaret, had never visited him. She had never even accepted his collect phone calls. His former friends from the country club had completely erased him from their memories. Every single Tuesday, the prison guards distributed the mail. David always stood by his cell door. He waited with a desperate, hollow hope. But his name was never called, not once. Finally, he decided to do the only thing he could. He decided to write a letter. He went to the prison commissary. He purchased a cheap blue pen and a pad of lined yellow paper. He sat at the small metal desk in his cell. He stared at the blank page for hours. He did not have a keyboard. He did not have software to hide behind. He could not press a button to delete his mistakes. He had to write with his own hands. He wrote to Chloe. It took him 3 agonizing days to finish a single page. He finally admitted the absolute truth. He did not make excuses. He did not blame the divorce. He did not blame his mother. He confessed that his own greed had destroyed their family. He confessed that he was a coward. He sealed the envelope. He handed it to the guard. He did not expect forgiveness. He only hoped for a tiny sliver of peace. 2 weeks later, that yellow envelope arrived at our bright townhouse in Atlanta. It was a warm Wednesday afternoon. Chloe brought the mail inside. She dropped a stack of catalogs on the kitchen island. But she held onto the yellow envelope. She stared at the return address. The bold letters indicated the state penitentiary. Her hands began to tremble slightly. I turned away from the stove. I immediately recognized the look on her face. I dried my hands on a towel and walked over to her. I did not push her. I simply stood beside her, offering my silent support. "It is from him," Chloe whispered. Her voice was incredibly fragile. "You do not have to open it," I told her firmly. "You do not owe him anything. Not your time. Not your attention. You can throw it straight into the trash. I will fully support whatever choice you make." Chloe took a deep breath. She reached for the kitchen scissors. She carefully sliced the envelope open. She pulled out the folded yellow paper. The handwriting was shaky and uneven. It did not look like the confident signature David used to sign on expensive checks. Chloe read the letter in absolute silence. I watched a dozen different emotions cross her face. There was a flash of old anger. There was a brief moment of profound sadness. But finally, her expression settled into something incredibly powerful. It was complete indifference. She placed the letter on the granite countertop. She looked up at me. Her eyes were completely clear. "He says he is finally sorry," Chloe said quietly. "He says he realizes what he threw away." "How does that make you feel?" I asked gently. "It feels like it is just too late," Chloe replied. She did not sound bitter. She sounded incredibly mature. "I spent a year crying over him. I spent a year hating myself because I thought I wasn't enough for him to stay honest. But this letter doesn't change anything. It doesn't undo the damage. I forgive him, Mom, but I do not want him in my life." She picked up the yellow letter. She walked over to the paper shredder in my home office. She fed the letter into the machine. We listened to the sharp, grinding sound of the paper being destroyed. It was a deeply satisfying sound. Chloe turned around and smiled at me. The heavy ghost of David Jenkins was finally, permanently gone from our home. The past was destroyed. Only the future remained. The morning of Chloe's high school graduation was completely flawless. The sky over Atlanta was a brilliant, endless blue. There was not a single cloud in sight. I woke up long before the sun began to rise. Old military habits are incredibly hard to break, but I did not wake up with a sense of dread. I woke up with a heart completely overflowing with gratitude. Today was the ultimate victory. It was a victory we had fought for with every ounce of our strength. I walked into Chloe's bedroom. Her graduation gown was hanging neatly on the closet door. It was a deep, rich navy blue. Beside it hung the golden honor cords she had earned through years of relentless hard work. She had maintained a perfect grade point average. She had secured a full academic scholarship to a prestigious university. David had tried to steal her educational future, but Chloe had simply built a brand new one with her own 2 hands. We drove to the massive high school football stadium. The bleachers were already packed with thousands of proud families. The air buzzed with pure excitement. I found our reserved seats near the 50-yard line. I did not sit alone. On my left sat Eleanor, the brilliant attorney who had fought like a lioness in that courtroom. On my right sat retired Judge Arthur Sterling. He wore a sharp linen suit and a warm, grandfatherly smile. We had become genuine family over the last 3 years. We were a family built on absolute truth, not just biology. The traditional marching band music began to play. The long line of graduating seniors filed onto the bright green turf. I immediately spotted Chloe. She was glowing. She scanned the massive crowd until her eyes finally locked onto ours. She raised her hand and waved fiercely. Judge Sterling chuckled beside me. He leaned over and patted my shoulder. "You did an outstanding job," Captain Sterling whispered. "She is a remarkable young woman. We both survived the blast." "Sir," I replied softly. When the principal called Chloe's name, I stood up. I cheered louder than anyone else in that entire section. I watched my beautiful daughter walk across that wooden stage. She accepted her diploma with a bright, confident smile at that exact moment. A profound sense of closure washed over my soul. The long, brutal war was officially over. Later that evening, we hosted a massive celebration at our townhouse. The backyard was filled with laughter, bright string lights, and good food. Members of my nonprofit organization, the Defender's Shield, were there. We had successfully helped over 200 military families fight back against parental alienation. We had changed the laws in 3 different states. We had turned our deepest pain into a powerful, unbreakable shield for others. As the party began to wind down, I stepped away from the crowded patio. I stood near the edge of the garden. I looked up at the quiet, starry sky. I thought about the Fulton County courtroom. I thought about the devastating moment David had called me a complete failure. He had intended to break me. He had intended to erase my legacy. But he had fundamentally misunderstood what it means to be a soldier. You can knock a soldier down into the mud. You can strip away their resources. You can ambush them when they least expect it. But a true soldier never, ever surrenders. Chloe walked up behind me. She wrapped her arms around my waist. She rested her chin on my shoulder. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" she asked softly. "I am just thinking about how incredibly lucky I am," I told her. I placed my hands over hers. "I traveled all over the world. I saw terrible things. I saw beautiful things. But right here, in this exact moment, is the best place I have ever been." Chloe smiled against my shoulder. "I am so proud of you. Mom, you are my hero." I closed my eyes. I let those beautiful words settle deep into my heart. Medals will eventually tarnish. Uniforms will eventually fade. But the love between a mother and her child is absolutely indestructible. It can survive distance. It can survive lies. It can even survive the darkest acts of betrayal. We had fought for our peace. We had defended our truth. And as I stood there, holding my daughter under the quiet night sky, I knew with absolute certainty that we had finally won. The story of Sarah and Chloe is a powerful, emotional reminder that the darkest betrayals often come from those who originally promised to protect us. As women, and especially as mothers, society places an incredibly heavy, unfair burden on our shoulders. We are constantly expected to sacrifice everything, yet we are the very first to be harshly judged when we step outside the traditional, quiet boxes built for us. We live in a world with a devastating double standard. If a man goes away to serve his country, he is celebrated with a parade. But when a mother does the exact same thing to provide a secure future for her family, her devotion to her child is viciously questioned. But the deepest, most urgent lesson in this story goes far beyond a dramatic courtroom victory. It sheds a glaring light on the devastating reality of parental alienation, a silent, toxic epidemic where a child's love is deliberately manipulated, intercepted, and weaponized by a bitter partner. It is a profound form of emotional violence that leaves invisible scars. Sarah's journey teaches us that you cannot fight psychological abuse with screaming matches, tears, or petty revenge. You fight it with unshakable composure, hard evidence, and the blinding light of the truth. Healing is not about destroying the person who broke your heart. It is about reclaiming your own narrative. It is about standing firm in your reality, even when someone else is desperately trying to rewrite your history. If you are currently navigating a toxic divorce, or if someone is actively trying to erase your worth and turn your loved ones against you, remember Sarah's unyielding resilience. Do not ever let their lies become your truth. Trust your own strength, hold your head high, and never, ever surrender your peace. This content was meticulously researched, carefully constructed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful value and life lessons.